A German shepherd was found crawling into a ditch, his frail body barely moving, his eyes filled with fear. But what truly shocked us was why he was hiding. His past held a terrifying secret, one that no one could have imagined. Stay with us. Until the end, because this story will change the way you see animal resilience forever. The wind howled through the barren field, sending dry leaves swirling across the cracked pavement. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and deep purple, but Mark Evans barely noticed. He had been out for a long drive, trying to clear his mind after another restless night. But something caught his eye. A slight movement, near the side of the road. At first he thought it was just a pile of dirt shifting in the wind, but when he looked closer, he saw the unmistakable shape of a dog. The animal was crawling, dragging itself toward a deep ditch, its frail body barely able to move. Mark's heart clenched. This wasn't normal. Slowing down, he pulled his truck onto the shoulder of the road. The moment he stepped out, the cold air hit him, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran down his spine as he got a closer look at the dog. It was a German shepherd, but barely recognizable as one. His ribs jutted out through his patchy, matted fur, and his hip bones stuck out like daggers. His tail was tucked so tightly between his legs that it seemed glued to his body, and his ears, once proud and erect, hung limply to the sides. But what hit Mark the hardest were his eyes. They were hollow, sunken, filled with nothing but terror. The dog didn't run, he didn't bark, he didn't growl. He just tried to disappear. Mark took a cautious step forward, kneeling slowly. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured, keeping his voice low and calm. The dog flinched violently, his frail body trembling even harder. Mark froze. This dog wasn't just abandoned. He was terrified. He watched as the shepherd forced himself to keep crawling toward the ditch, as if trying to hide from the world. His breathing was ragged, his body too weak to even stand properly. Mark's chest tightened. This was more than just a stray looking for food. This was a dog that had been through something horrible. He glanced around, trying to make sense of it. There were no houses nearby, no signs of other animals. How long had he been out here? How had he survived this long? Mark swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to act. "All right, buddy, I won't hurt you," he said softly. The dog let out the faintest whimper, a sound so weak that it barely reached Mark's ears. That sound broke something inside him. He couldn't just leave him there. Reaching into his truck, Mark grabbed an old flannel jacket and a bottle of water. He moved slowly, giving the shepherd time to process his presence. The dog's breathing remained unsteady, but he didn't attempt to bite or snarl. That, more than anything, scared Mark. A normal stray would fight, would try to protect itself. But this dog had already given up. Carefully, Mark placed the jacket on the ground, trying to offer something warm. He unscrewed the cap of the water bottle and poured a small puddle onto the fabric. "Here, buddy," he coaxed. The dog hesitated, his dull brown eyes flickering toward the water. For the first time, Mark saw something other than fear in his expression. Hunger, desperation, a flicker of hope. The shepherd's tongue darted out, licking at the moisture on the fabric. His body was still trembling, but Mark could tell he wanted to trust. He just didn't know how. Mark took a deep breath. He was going to help this dog no matter what it took. But as he slowly reached a hand forward, something in the dirt caught his eye. Something buried. His breath hitched as he leaned closer, pushing aside the damp soil. What he saw sent a cold shiver down his spine. A rusted metal tag attached to a collar with a name almost completely scratched out. Mark's fingers tightened around the object as realization settled in. This dog wasn't just abandoned. He had been discarded, and whoever did this didn't want him to be found. Mark's fingers tightened around the rusted metal tag, his pulse quickening. He brushed away more of the damp soil, revealing the remains of a tattered, half-buried collar. The leather was cracked, brittle from exposure to the elements, and the metal clasp was rusted nearly shut, but it was the nameplate that sent a chill through his spine. Most of the engraving was scratched out, deliberately damaged, as if someone had tried to erase its existence. Only a few letters remained visible. THR. Mark's eyes flicked back to the German shepherd, who remained curled in the dirt, his frail body still trembling. Was this his collar? Who had tried to erase his identity? His gut told him this wasn't just a case of neglect. This was something worse. Mark swallowed hard and turned his attention back to the dog. The shepherd had tucked his head further down, attempting to make himself as small as possible, as if he expected punishment. Mark's heart clenched at the sight. Slowly, he placed the collar beside him and reached for his jacket again, laying it even closer to the dog. "Easy, buddy. I'm not going to hurt you." The shepherd flinched at the sound of his voice, his entire body tensing. He had heard those words before, but from someone who didn't mean them. Mark noticed something then. A faint, jagged scar, running along the dog's side, disappearing beneath the patchy, matted fur. He sucked in a breath. That wasn't from an accident. That was from a blade. His fists clenched instinctively, anger bubbling beneath his skin. Someone had done this. Someone had hurt this dog intentionally. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Right now, his anger wouldn't help. The only thing that mattered was gaining this dog's trust. The shepherd's eyes flicked toward the water-soaked jacket, his tongue darting out to lick at the moisture again. That was a good sign. He was dehydrated badly, but at least he still had the instinct to drink. Mark reached into his truck and pulled out a small bag of jerky. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. He tore off a tiny piece, crouching down again. "Here," he murmured, holding out the food. The shepherd didn't move at first. He stared at the offering, his body remaining tense as if unsure whether this was a trick. Then his nose twitched. A second later, he took the smallest, most hesitant movement forward. Mark stayed perfectly still, his hand extended, heart pounding in his chest. The dog sniffed the jerky, then with a trembling jaw, he took it. Mark barely breathed. This was the moment. The shepherd chewed slowly, his sunken eyes never leaving Mark's face, waiting, expecting something bad to happen. But nothing did. Mark just sat there, no sudden movements, no threats, no harm. The shepherd swallowed, still unsure, but he hadn't been hurt. Mark carefully tore off another piece, placing it gently on the ground between them. "Go ahead, buddy. It's yours." The shepherd hesitated again, but the hunger won over his fear. He crawled slightly closer, just enough to take the second bite. Mark exhaled, his chest tight with emotion. This wasn't just a starving dog, this was a soul that had been completely shattered by cruelty. He couldn't imagine what this dog had gone through, what had been done to him. But one thing was clear. Thor had never known kindness before. For a long moment, the two just sat there, the wind howling around them. Then a sound broke through the silence, a sharp rustling in the nearby trees. The shepherd's entire body went rigid, his ears flattened against his skull, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Mark's muscles tensed. That wasn't the wind. Someone was out there. His eyes darted toward the trees, scanning for movement. And then he saw it, a faint set of footprints in the mud leading away from the ditch. Fresh ones. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. Someone had been here recently, and judging by Thor's terror, whoever it was, they weren't done with him yet. Mark's breath came out in slow, controlled puffs of condensation as he stared at the footprints in the mud. They weren't old. The dampness of the earth meant they had been made recently, maybe within the last few hours. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. His gut twisted. Had they been watching him? Watching Thor? Mark's eyes flicked back to the German shepherd, who remained, frozen in place, his frail body rigid with terror. His ears were pinned back, his muscles stiff, as if he were waiting for something bad to happen. Mark swallowed hard. This dog wasn't just afraid. He was reliving something. Someone had hurt him before, and that person had been here. Mark took a slow step toward the footprints, keeping one eye on Thor to make sure he didn't spook him again. The shepherd didn't move. He simply lay there, his breath shallow, his thin body pressing into the cold earth as if he were trying to disappear. Mark knelt down, studying the tracks carefully. They were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy-set or carrying something. The mud had formed a small drag mark alongside the prints, as if the person had been pulling something. His jaw clenched. Was it Thor? Had someone dragged him here? A sharp gust of wind rattled the bare branches of the trees, and Thor flinched violently, curling into himself. Mark's hands instinctively balled into fists. Who did this to you? His eyes flicked back to the rusted collar lying in the dirt. He picked it up again, running his fingers over the scratched metal tag, THR. Mark exhaled slowly, his heart pounding with realization. This dog had a name. Someone had wanted it erased. Mark turned back toward Thor, who was still curled in on himself, his breathing shallow. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice low and calm. Thor flinched at the sound, but didn't look away. This time, his hollow brown eyes remained locked onto Mark's movements, watching him with a mix of fear and desperate curiosity. Mark carefully placed the collar back on the ground, then pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. A quick Google search for German Shepherd missing plus THR wouldn't hurt. As the page loaded, Mark felt something press against his knee. His breath hitched. Thor had moved. The dog had inched forward just enough for his nose to barely touch Mark's leg. His ears were still low, his tail unmoving, but for the first time, he had made contact on his own. Mark stayed perfectly still, his throat tight with emotion. "Good boy," he whispered. Thor remained there, his breathing, still uneasy but no longer ragged with panic. Mark slowly turned his attention back to his phone. The search results loaded, and his stomach dropped. A news article from 8 months ago. Dog fighting ring busted in local county. Suspected abuse of over 30 dogs. Mark's grip tightened, on the phone as he clicked the article. There was a photo attached, a blurry, grainy image of a makeshift kennel, wire fencing covered in tarps. But in the corner of the image, a German shepherd, thin and scarred, crouched in the corner of a filthy cage. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Thor. It was him. The article stated that several dogs had been recovered, but not all of them survived. The report mentioned one dog escaping before authorities could rescue him. Mark's fingers tightened around the phone. Thor hadn't escaped. He had been dumped. The drag marks in the mud, the erased name, the absolute terror in his eyes. Whoever owned this dog hadn't wanted him to live. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes flicking back to Thor. The shepherd hadn't moved, his tired eyes still locked on Mark. "You a fighter, aren't you?" Mark murmured. Thor blinked slowly, his body still tense but no longer completely frozen. Mark knew then that Thor wasn't just a stray. He was a survivor. And whoever had left him here wasn't expecting him to be found. Mark exhaled sharply. He wasn't leaving this dog behind. Not now, not ever. Mark felt a wave of cold anger settle in his chest as he reread the article on his phone. The words blurred slightly in the dim light of the setting sun, but the details were clear enough. A dog-fighting ring had been shut down in this very county months ago, and Thor had been a part of it. The scars, the erased name, the way he flinched, at every movement, it all made sense now. Mark's gaze flicked to the dog, who was still curled in on himself, his breathing shallow. Thor had survived that hell only to be thrown away like garbage. Mark clenched his jaw. Not anymore. He reached, out slowly, placing his hand palm up in the dirt between them. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, his voice steady. "Let's get you out of here." Thor stiffened, his ribs expanding sharply with a nervous breath. Mark didn't push. He simply waited, letting the shepherd process the moment. Trust wasn't something he could demand. Thor's eyes flicked to Mark's outstretched hand, his thin body trembling, but he didn't recoil as much this time. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he shifted forward just an inch. Mark's throat tightened. It was progress. You're okay, Mark whispered. I won't let anyone hurt you again. The words seemed to hit something deep inside Thor. His ears twitched slightly, and for the first time, his tail gave the smallest, weakest movement, not quite a wag, but not completely lifeless either. Mark slowly reached for his flannel jacket, the same one he had laid on the ground earlier. With careful movements, he draped it gently over Thor's back. The shepherd flinched at first, his entire body locking up. Mark froze, waiting. A few long, tense seconds passed before Thor exhaled shakily. He didn't bolt. Mark let out a slow breath, of his own. That's it, buddy, he murmured. Just one step at a time. Now came the hard part. Thor was still too weak to walk properly, and Mark knew carrying him outright would send him into a full panic. He needed to do this carefully. Mark adjusted his stance, shifting into a crouch beside Thor. I'm going to help you stand, okay? Thor's ears twitched again, but he didn't pull away. Mark slid an arm under his frail body, supporting his weight as gently as he could. He expected resistance, maybe even fear snapping into aggression, but instead, Thor just collapsed into him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The shepherd's body sagged against him, his bony frame trembling from weakness. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was surrender. He had fought for so long, endured so much, and now he just didn't have the strength to fight anymore. Mark swallowed hard, carefully adjusting his grip. I got you, buddy, he whispered. With slow, measured movements, he lifted Thor into his arms. The dog let out a faint whimper, his head resting weakly against Mark's chest, but he didn't struggle. Mark moved quickly, carrying Thor toward his truck. The footprints in the mud still lingered in his peripheral vision, but he forced himself to focus. Whoever left those prints could wait. Right now, getting Thor to safety was all that mattered. He reached the truck, carefully setting Thor onto the passenger seat. The dog curled into himself again, his body stiff, but he didn't try to run. Mark turned on the heat, letting warm air fill the cabin. For the first time, Thor's shivering began to slow. Mark sat back in his seat, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he let out a long breath. Thor was safe for now, but this fight was far from over. The hum of the truck's heater filled the cabin, wrapping the air in much-needed warmth. Mark kept his hands steady on the wheel, glancing over at Thor every few seconds. The German shepherd lay curled up on the passenger seat, his body still trembling, but his shivering had slowed significantly. The warmth was doing its job. Even so, his posture was stiff, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Mark exhaled. This wasn't going to be easy. The drive home was silent, except for the occasional soft whimper that escaped Thor's throat. Each time Mark's chest tightened. What had they done to him? How long had he suffered? He gritted his teeth, forcing his anger down. Right now, emotions wouldn't help. Thor needed action, not rage. After what felt like an eternity, Mark pulled into his driveway. His small cabin sat nestled among tall pine trees, the porch light casting a warm glow against the cold night. It was a simple home, quiet and safe. Exactly what Thor needed. Mark shut off the engine and turned to Thor. The dog had lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, fear, and something else. Hope. Mark grabbed his jacket from the back seat and draped it over his arm before stepping out. The cold air bit at his skin again, but he ignored it. Thor came first. Carefully, he opened the passenger door. The shepherd's body tensed immediately, his tail tucking between his legs, his ears flattened. He pressed himself against the seat as if expecting something terrible to happen. Mark's heart clenched. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, keeping his voice low and calm. "No one's going to hurt you." Thor didn't move. His body was still frozen in fear. Mark took a slow step closer, holding out his hand palm up. Thor's eyes locked onto it, his breath coming in uneven, shallow bursts. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Thor made A choice. With a deep, shaky breath, he inched forward. Not much, just enough to barely graze Mark's fingertips with his nose. Mark swallowed hard. It was the smallest act of trust, but after everything this dog had been through, it was monumental. "That's it," Mark encouraged softly. Slowly, carefully, he reached down and lifted Thor into his arms again. This time, Thor didn't resist. The shepherd let out a soft whimper as Mark carried him inside, but it wasn't a sound of fear, it was exhaustion. Mark nudged the door open with his foot and stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin washed over them instantly, chasing away the bitter chill of the outside air. Thor's body relaxed slightly at the new sensation. Mark gently set him down on a thick blanket near the fireplace. The shepherd immediately curled into himself, pressing his frail frame into the soft fabric. Mark crouched beside him, rubbing his hands together to warm them before carefully placing a bowl of water near Thor's nose. The dog hesitated, sniffing it wearily, then finally he drank. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He's trying. He wants to live. After a few hesitant laps, Thor's head sank onto the blanket, his breathing still uneven but no longer trembling violently. Mark sat beside him, watching the firelight flicker in the shepherd's tired eyes. "You're safe now," he murmured. Thor didn't react, but for the first time he didn't flinch at the sound of Mark's voice. Outside, the wind howled against the trees, but inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Thor was warm. And maybe, just maybe, he believed that tomorrow would be better. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the slow, steady breathing of Thor. Mark sat nearby, his elbows resting on his knees, watching the German shepherd carefully. The dog was asleep, curled up on the blanket, his frail body finally still. The warmth of the fire had chased away the cold, and for the first time since Mark found him, Thor wasn't trembling. It was progress, a victory. But Mark knew this wasn't the end of the fight. His gaze traveled over Thor's scarred body, over the sharp ridges of his ribs still visible beneath his patchy fur. The shepherd was still weak, still recovering from whatever hell he had been through. Mark let out a slow breath, his mind replaying everything he had learned so far. Thor had been a fighter, not by choice, but because someone had forced him to be. He had escaped or been discarded only to barely survive on his own. And then there were the footprints in the mud, the ones Mark had seen near the ditch. Someone had been watching. That thought made his stomach churn. Was it the person who abandoned him? Were they looking for him? Mark shook his head. No, he couldn't focus on that right now. Thor was here, he was safe. That was all that mattered. Still, Mark double-checked the locks on the door before settling back into his chair. He wasn't taking any chances. A few hours passed. The fire had burned lower, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Mark was drifting between wakefulness and sleep when the sound hit him like a bullet, a deep, broken whimper. His eyes snapped open, his chest tightening. Thor was thrashing in his sleep, his legs kicking weakly, his paws twitching against the blanket. A muffled cry escaped his throat, raw and full of terror. Mark was beside him in an instant. Hey, buddy," he said gently, reaching out but stopping just short of touching him. He didn't want to startle him. "It's okay. You're safe." But Thor wasn't in the cabin anymore. Wherever his mind had taken him, it was somewhere dark, somewhere painful. The whimpers grew louder, his body twisting as if he were trying to escape, something that wasn't there. His ears were pinned flat, his breathing sharp and ragged. Mark's gut twisted. What had they done to you? Carefully, he reached out again, this time letting his fingers barely brush against Thor's side. The contact was light, just enough to let the dog know he wasn't alone. Thor's entire body jerked, his eyes flying open, wild and unfocused. For a single heart-stopping moment, Mark saw it, the pure, unfiltered terror in those brown eyes. Thor scrambled backward instinctively, his frail body colliding with the wall. His chest heaved, his ears still pressed flat. Mark didn't move. He didn't speak. He just waited. Thor's eyes darted around the cabin, his breath coming in uneven gasps. He was still caught between worlds, the nightmare and reality. And then finally, his gaze landed on Mark. Recognition flickered. The shepherd let out a deep, shuddering exhale, his body sagging slightly, his ears twitching, then slowly lifting just a little. Mark let out the breath he had been holding. "There you go," he murmured softly. "You're here. You're safe." Thor blinked, his body still tense, but he didn't try to run again. It took another minute before he cautiously crept forward, his steps slow and shaky. When he reached the blanket, he hesitated. Then, in the smallest act of trust yet, Thor carefully lowered himself back down. Mark's chest tightened. The shepherd still didn't trust him completely, but he wanted to. Mark settled back onto the floor, giving Thor space. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not here." Thor didn't react at first, but then his head lowered onto his paws, his eyes fluttering shut again. The tension in the room eased. Mark leaned his head back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the snow-covered ground outside. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire still lingered from the night before. Mark rubbed the sleep from his eyes, stretching his sore muscles as he sat up. He hadn't intended to fall asleep on the couch, but after Thor's nightmare, he hadn't wanted to leave him alone. His gaze immediately searched for the shepherd. Thor was still curled on the blanket by the fireplace, his breathing slow and steady. For the first time, he looked at peace. Mark exhaled, relieved. Maybe they were finally turning a corner. He stood and walked toward the kitchen, careful not to make too much noise. He filled a bowl with fresh water and grabbed a small portion of soft dog food, nothing too heavy since Thor's stomach was still adjusting. The sound of the food being set down must have stirred the dog because Thor lifted his head. Mark froze. Thor's eyes were on him, but something was different. They weren't filled with terror or hesitation. They were curious. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat and crouched down, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "Morning, buddy," he murmured. "You hungry?" Thor's nose twitched, but he didn't immediately move. He still wasn't sure. Mark pushed the bowl slightly. Closer. A moment passed. Then, with the smallest sign of trust yet, Thor lifted himself onto shaky legs and stepped forward. Mark held his breath as the shepherd took the first bite. He had accepted food from Mark before, but this time there was no hesitation, no fear, just hunger. Mark felt something inside him break and rebuild at the same time. "You're a tough one," he whispered, more to himself than to Thor. The shepherd finished eating, licking the last traces of food from the bowl. Then, he did something Mark never expected. He took a step toward him, not toward the door, not away from the human he had feared for so long, but toward Mark. Mark's heart pounded. Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand, palm up, just like before. He wouldn't force it. The choice had to be Thor's. The shepherd hesitated just for a second, then he closed the distance and pressed his nose into Mark's palm. Mark's breath hitched. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. "You did it, buddy," he whispered, his throat tight. "You're safe now." Thor blinked up at him. Then in one final act of trust, he lowered his head against Mark's knee. Mark let out a soft laugh, running his hand gently over the dog's scarred head. He had made it. Thor had chosen to stay. Mark exhaled, letting himself enjoy the moment, but the back of his mind still lingered on the footprints near the ditch. Someone had been watching, and he had a feeling whoever left Thor to die wasn't expecting him to survive. He reached for his phone and pulled up the article about the busted dogfighting ring again. One name stood out, a former handler who had vanished before the arrests were made. The authorities were still looking for him. Mark's grip on his phone tightened as he glanced down at Thor, who had curled up beside him, finally resting without fear. No matter what, he wouldn't let anyone take this away from him. Whoever had hurt Thor, they weren't going to get a second chance. Mark would make sure of it. For now, though, he let himself breathe. Thor was home, and this time, no one would take that away from him. Thor's journey was one of survival, trust, and resilience. From being abandoned in a ditch to finally finding warmth, safety, and love, he proved that even the most broken souls can heal with patience and kindness. But his past still lingered, and those responsible may still be out there. What do you think should happen next? Let us know in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances and help us spread the message of hope and compassion.